the quality of life argument says that the quality of our lives is actually worse than we believe it to be. What? No, that's actually what the argument says. We are wrong about our own well-being, and the well-being of our potential children. It's an argument used by philosopher David Benatar in his 2006 book, Better Never to Have Been, which argues that it is not morally acceptable to have kids. If you have not checked out the first video in my Antinatalism Explained series, please check that out here. If you've already seen it, then here's an outline of today's video. Number 1. How can we be wrong about our own well-being? Number 2. Are we actually wrong about our own well-being? And lastly, a thought experiment which I devised myself, which highlights different schools of thought on the quality of life argument, and I'll call this the paradox of self-evaluation. Alright, so the argument in broad strokes is that we are not necessarily accurate judges of our own quality of life, and by extension would not be accurate judges in estimating the quality of life of those we bring into the world. If we do decide to have children based upon the quality of life of the potential child, then recall from the first video that you would presumably only do so if they had a life that was above a bar for the life worth starting. If Benatar is right, and we are not accurate judges of the quality of life of our children, then that leaves room open that the actual quality of life of our children is lower than we expect them to be, which means it will be immoral to have kids. Part 1. How can we be wrong about our own well-being? Benatar introduces his quality of life argument by giving us 3 psychological mechanisms. Firstly, the Pollyanna Principle. Secondly, Adaptation. And thirdly, Comparison. The Pollyanna Principle, also known as optimism bias, is our propensity towards optimism. It's not one particular tendency, but rather a spectrum of different psychological tendencies. I'll give you 3 examples for a taster of what is meant. I'll separate it out into past, future, and present. So firstly, focusing on the now. People in general report themselves as happier than the average person, which by itself is a mathematical impossibility, because not everyone can be above the average by the definition of the average. As an example from one experiment, students were asked to measure their feelings during the day from a scale of +2 to -2, with +2 being the best anyone can feel, and -2 being the worst anyone can feel. 0 was used to represent the average feelings of the class. The average score of the 192 subjects was +0.4. Thus, the average person in the class felt better than the average feelings of the class. Secondly, focusing on the future, people consistently and irrationally report that their future will be better off 5 years from now in spite of repeated evidence to the contrary. Furthermore, think about how bleak the future can or probably will be. And it's going to get a bit grim for the next 10 seconds. So we have the loss of our health, our vitality, our intelligence, we have loss of work role. If we have dementia, we're going to lose our sense of self. We will lose our actual selves one day when we die. And most chilling of all is that you will, in fact, lose everyone you love and hold dear and care about. But lucky for us, we have the Pollyanna Principle, which wants to claim that we have self-deception built into us, so that this grim reality is not really usually made apparent, except for very rare cases like right now when I just listed off all those terrible things. So let that sink in. Thirdly, looking backwards. We usually remember happy events more than sad events. This is shown by one study, where participants were asked to list events that happened over the past week, with whether they were positive or negative. And they also listed the events with their intensities. They were then later asked to recall as many events as they could and as accurately as they could. So not only do they recall the positive events more and more accurately, but if they were then asked to judge the intensity of the events, we will find that the negative events ended up being less intense, whereas the positive events remained relatively similar. This is really interesting because it shows not only that we forget negative events more, but the intensity of the negative events actually decreases over time. So there you go. We have an overly cheerful, unrealistically optimistic outlook on our past, present, and future. Is that all we have to show that we could be wrong about our well-being? No, Benatar asks us to consider two more psychological mechanisms. The second one is adaptation. Adaptation says that when life takes a turn for the worse, then while we may at first experience subjective dissatisfaction, our levels of subjective well-being will return to their original levels somewhat. Let's take this slowly. With an example. For example, I've just been in a car accident. I've lost my leg. The first few weeks totally suck, but it gets better. I adapt. I learn to bear the pain. It becomes less and less uncomfortable to navigate through unconventional methods. While at first I was absolutely shredded by the thought that I could no longer do my favorite pastimes, such as playing soccer. I don't play soccer actually. Driving a car, or doing sick dance moves. I realized there's more to life than this. And you can see how this goes, right? It's a common story. Basically, my subjective dissatisfaction will eventually lessen. Maybe not to original levels of joy, but it will no longer be terrible. Why is adaptation important according to Benatar? Well, the argument goes that since we adapt, we cannot accurately measure our own well-being. Even if people's lives were to get objectively worse, for example, they may live in more polluted environments, more aesthetically degraded surrounds, they may lose substantial amounts of wealth or even their leg, there would be little difference at the end of the day to their subjective well-being. How then, if our lives may in fact get worse, yet we adapt to the effects, can we understand just how well our lives are going? The last psychological mechanism is comparison. We don't know how good our lives are, all things considered. It will always be a comparison to someone, imagined or not. When I say, "Oh, my morning was so bad, I stubbed my toe on the door on the way out," I say that because I know ordinarily that's not something that people do. On the other hand, if everyone stubbed their toe on the way out every morning, then I would not bother to say this. And what this means for us is that the negative features of life shared by everyone, for example, the stress, tiredness, itchiness, all these things, they're not actually being considered when we think about our well-being. Like adaptation, we are ignoring objectively negative facts of our existence and getting a skewed perspective of our well-being. Furthermore, recall that comparison says that we compare ourselves to others. That must mean there's no standard benchmark, no standard test that we can use between people. Well, if that is true, then clearly we are far from being perfect judges of ourselves because we can't even be judges of ourselves, full stop. Since we have no objective litmus test that we can use on ourselves, then the argument goes that it cannot even make sense to talk about your own well-being, surely. So there we have it. We have Pollyannaism, adaptation, and comparison. These are the three psychological mechanisms which Benatar believes gives us an altogether rosy, unreliable picture of the world. But how does this actually hold up? Part 2. Are we actually wrong about our well-being? It seems that while Pollyanna as well as comparison and adaptation do show that we tend to overlook and evaluate our lives better than they may be in an objective sense, they nevertheless have difficulties. I will list two of them. The first and most pressing is that the primary judge for our lives' well-being still seems to be us somehow. If you're super sad and someone comes up to you and tells you you should be happy, and then gives you seemingly objective reasons for why you should be happy, you would just say, sort of, I'm really sad, right? Likewise, if you're a mother of 5 in rural India, you're living far below the poverty line, you're spending 5 hours a day on laundry, another 5 fetching water from a polluted well. Well, if someone were to tell you that your life is relatively miserable compared to most of the planet, you would just say the same thing, you say sort of. Our self-assessment, it seems, has got to count for something, and Benatar seems to be trying to undermine this by constantly trying to find an objective benchmark where we probably don't need one. I will call this the primacy view of self-evaluation, where your subjective self-evaluation trumps all and is what in some sense constitutes your well-being. So if you accept the primacy view, then you would have to say that you can never be wrong about your own well-being because, in fact, you are always right. A second problem with being wrong in your own self-evaluation is the fact that adaptation and comparison should work for positive experiences as well, what I will call evaluative symmetry. Recall that adaptation says that we adapt to our negative experiences, so that we never really know our own well-being because our subjective experiences are constantly adapting or being habituated to our external facts. But I don't see why this will not work similarly for positive experiences. the hedonic treadmill is something that really exists. If I suddenly get heaps of cash and I go on tons of holidays, I will adapt to these positive experiences. My well-being may objectively go up, but my subjective well-being may stay at a baseline. And recall that comparison says that the negative features shared across all our lives are mute in our judgments of our well-being. Well, surely if this is true, it appears to be true for positive experiences as well. I mean, the people I hang around with, we all enjoy cups of coffee, we all enjoy chips, we all enjoy peeing after you've held the pee in for a long time. But if asked to consider your well-being generally, we don't normally talk about these things. Therefore, why consider negative and positive experiences differently when discussing comparison? Now, I admit, Benatar does consider this. He says that since we work under the optimistic bias, that is Pollyannism, that thus in the best case, adaptation and comparison reinforce Pollyannism. In the worst case, they mitigate it, but do not negate it entirely. But I have to admit, I don't see exactly how this pans out. I've tried sketching it on paper and talked to friends, and I can't really see it. Because in my mind, if we do work under the baseline of Pollyannism, then that means more of our experiences would have a positive valence or a positive bias, right? Then surely adaptation would mean that we would get habituated to those positively valenced feelings or experiences. So surely we would adapt, and that would make life a bit worse, right? Same for comparison. Surely if we all have Pollyannism and we all experiences these positive experiences, we would all share the same Pollyannized experiences, right? So surely comparison would say we would ignore them? Anyways, I don't see quite how this works out. I accept the possibility that I am just really thick. And I do think Benatar does mean something here, but I'm just not quite getting it. So if you have any idea what Benatar means here, please leave a comment below and you might get featured in my next video. So sure, we could be wrong about ourselves, but that's not what's important here. Coming back to the main theme, antinatalism. The important part is whether we could be wrong about the future children we have. I think Pollyanna shows that we could be optimistically biased. When people have children, they usually think of all the joys and pleasantries they go through, but they rarely think of the potential devastations that could happen. In today's world plagued by mental health issues, it's not as unlikely as we would like to believe that they will not be devastated by anxiety, depression, or suicidal thoughts. Our propensity towards optimism will cause us to downplay the fact that our children will have negative experiences too. They will suffer hunger, sickness, tiredness, insomnia. They will die. It may not even be a pleasant death. Everyone they care about will die too. Sorry, super grim, but it's a fact. Anyone who considers bringing children into the world should meditate on these facts and then make their decision. Yet again, I don't concede that we are always optimistically biased. There are times when we could downplay the experiences of other people. For example, when discussing abortion, you usually hear something like, if my child gets tested positive for Down syndrome, then I'm going to have an abortion, right? There's something people sometimes say. And the interesting thing here is that the research shows that those with Down syndrome usually live more happier, fulfilled lives than those without Down syndrome. I'm not sure why. Maybe they have better relationships to their caregivers or something like this, I'm not sure. But it does appear that we're not excellent judges of other people as we like to believe. So whether we under or overestimate the lives of our future children, one thing is for sure, we should be more cautious and give potential consideration to the experiences of the people we bring into the world. We should consider both their joys and their sufferings. Like Benatar says, having a child can be like playing Russian roulette, and we should be aware of this fact. Always aware what they will go through, always empathetic to their potential happiness as well as potential devastations. Always aware. To end this video, I will introduce a thought experiment. Your answer to this thought experiment will help guide your own thoughts about procreation and well-being evaluation. Consider a depressed man, Derek. Derek says at some point, "I wish I was never born," or equivalently, "My life was not worth starting." It has now been a few years and Derek has gone through his depressive slump. He looks back in his life and reflects on past Derek. Of past Derek, he says, "What I said back then was wrong." The question now is, when was Derek right? Was it at both times? At neither times? Or at the later time, not the earlier time? I should clarify that this scenario is not entirely implausible. It's the fact that when suicidal people survive a suicide attempt, they will usually say something like, "What I thought before was wrong." They retrospectively judge themselves to have made an error in judgment. If you believe he was right in both times, you have accepted what I call the Primacy View. In the Primacy View, Derek's self-assessment is always right at every time. If you believe that Derek is wrong in one time and not the other, then you have what I call the Fallibilist View, because your view can be fallible, that is, wrong. What must be justified now is what makes something right or wrong. A problem with the Primacy View is that a logical contradiction naturally arises. For if the latter claim is true, then it is true that I was wrong in my earlier claim that I wished I was never born. This implies that I wished I was never born is a false claim. But by accepting that Derek is right in both times, I wish I was never born is also a true claim. It cannot be both true and false, which is a contradiction. If you believe the Fallibilist view, on the other hand, you now have the trouble of justifying what makes a view right or wrong. Why would past Derek be wrong, but not current Derek? A more striking way to phrase this question is what makes your current view immune to being wrong, whereas your past view would be wrong. The door of skepticism has now opened. I will provide two possible answers for how the Fallibilist could respond, and show that they do not hold up. The first is that current Derek has more information or the more recent view, and therefore that's why he's right. Well, let's assume that's true. Then what if in a few years' time something tragic happens to Derek? He gets quite miserable again. He looks back on the current self and he says, "What I said back then, when I was glad I did exist, is wrong." Under the view that the most recent view is the best and most informed, you will have to contend that, yes, my current judgment may very well be wrong. But this attacks our current selves in a way we don't want. If our current selves are living such amazing lives, we don't want someone to tell us we're wrong, even if it is our future selves, right? The second way the Fallibilists can defend themselves from skepticism is to say that those who are glad they have been born have a more reliable or accurate view of the world than those who wish they were never born. But if the past 10 minutes has taught us anything, it's that our self-assessments have issues and are not necessarily justified. You have to show that people who are glad they were born are in fact more credible in their view than people who wish they were never born for claims regarding their own personal assessment. This is not impossible, but it is a difficult task, and I am not sure if the current psychological literature has reached a conclusion on this claim. If you think you have found a way to justify this, post it in the comments. So these were two possible escape routes to defend the Fallibilist claim from the skeptical attack. Can you think of another one? And with that, so ends the second of my antinatalism videos. It was a lot longer than I expected. Expect a third and final video soon, which will discuss a whole host of other topics not yet covered. It will be amazing, I promise you. If you enjoyed it, please like, add a comment, and subscribe for more philosophy. See you then.